Alright guys, Murph's here. And today we're going to be talking about what makes something an intermediate cartridge. And a couple other things are going to get defined along the way as well, but we're not going to delve as deep into them. Now, a couple things to warn you guys of right off the bat. So this conversation is kind of going to be laced with a lot of rabbit holes, and I apologize for that in advance. However, this is more or less just me kind of having a conversation with y'all. So if that's not necessarily something that you're looking to get involved into right now and you're looking for some content with maybe a little bit more information, maybe check out some other stuff I got on the channel and see if it's more to your liking. But for the most part, this is just going to be a kind of discussion. All right, now, intermediate cartridge. What is an intermediate cartridge? I realized here recently that I've kind of been dropping this term fairly frequently without ever really addressing what that is. So we're going to kind of put it into my own terms. Now, an intermediate cartridge is a cartridge design that falls in between pistol and full power rifle cartridges. And the idea is to be able to project a fight stopping capability out to about 300 yards. Now, of course, we can all cite circumstances in which you can push an intermediate cartridge to greater overall distance. But if you look at most militaries with modern weapon systems, they are identifying 300 yards or meters, I guess, if you're going metric, as the point target engagement distance of their cartridge and rifle combination. That's with, optics and all that kind of stuff, being able to fight at much closer distances as well as much longer distances, kind of change up that variable. So, is it possible to engage to greater distances with an intermediate cartridge? Absolutely. 500, 600 meters, yards, whatever, they're not interchangeable by any means, but you get what I'm saying, are absolutely feasible engagement distances, depending on the cartridge. Now, there are a couple of cartridges that are kind of making waves, or have been making waves in the past couple of years. The 224 Valkyrie and the 6mm arc come to mind. And this is kind of what we're going to be doing, guys, just kind of discussing all these different, or a lot of these different intermediate cartridges as we move through this and kind of cover them throughout history. But I want to go ahead and specifically delve into both of these right now because I don't have that much experience with them. I haven't really pursued a lot of data or knowledge on them, and it specifically gets into this distance aspect. Now, the 224 Valkyrie and the 6mm arc are proclaimed to be these amazing 1,000-yard cartridges. Now, as I already said, I haven't done a lot of research on them. This is not a video on them specifically, but a couple things to take into account whenever we're talking about stretching intermediate cartridges to those type of distances, because I've read articles where a fella ran 5.56 out to 1,000 meters, which is an insane engagement distance. And something to kind of keep in mind, this is kind of like our first little rabbit hole here. Let's go ahead and keep a counter or something. What's important to keep in mind is that when you get out to that distance, how much energy are you actually transferring at that point? Now, of course, hits on target count. Regardless of whether or not they're fight stopping, if you start shooting somebody, regardless of what distance and what damage your bullet does to them, they've got to reevaluate all their life decisions up to that point in order to be able to figure out how to stop the red stuff from leaving their body. So that's not to say that it's not worthwhile to be able to engage with these cartridges to these astounding distances. However, if I could pick something that imparted more energy at that distance in order to be able to eliminate that threat, I think that would be more advantageous. It's kind of where I'm sitting at right now. Now, perhaps if I actually spend some time and delve into some research on that, maybe I would come back with a different answer. That's just how I initially assess this based off of what I hold to be true, what my experience have shown me in these types of scenarios and all that kind of stuff, and what my evaluation and relationship with physics leads me to believe. So that's just a little quick caveat on those. That's all we're probably going to talk about, those cartridges, for the rest of the time that we're doing this video. Now, the origin of intermediate cartridges. Now, guys, for years, decades, war was primarily fought with full power rifle cartridges. And that was because at the time, everyone was assessing the combat distance to be honestly kind of obscene when you consider that they were only engaging with iron sights out to 500 yards and beyond. And that's a tall task for somebody with iron sights, especially when you're shooting at somebody who doesn't want to be shot. I think that's one of the things that's not necessarily taken into context during this time. But regardless, now with the development of smokeless powder and the incorporation of Spitzer-type bullets and all this kind of stuff, you have flatter shooting trajectories, which means that you have, at these now longer distances, you have less correction on your sights in order to be able to make those impacts. So it's feasible as long as you can identify the target. That's kind of the key thing overall, is being able to identify the target. So, now, after a little while, two things would happen in warfare. One, we would start getting more and more specialized personnel involved in the fighting, but that were not necessarily tasked with just shooting somebody in the face. They had some sort of battlefield task that put them on the front lines and was still vital to the conduct of the battle, but they were not a rifleman. That's a big distinction right now. And we also have part two of this, which is war becomes more maneuver-based. It's not static trench-type fighting or short movements against one another. You're actually moving towards mechanized militaries. You're moving towards the point of being able to have so much of an advancement in your communications that you can actually communicate down to lower squad levels and be able to coordinate actions with these smaller elements maneuvering across the battlefield in some way that isn't like waving flags or blowing whistles or something like that. Like you can actually communicate between these different positions or between these maneuvering elements in order to be able to coordinate your attacks. Now, with all that being the case, the full power rifle cartridge and the full-size rifle start to find themselves kind of on the out, because as it turns out, it's more difficult for everyone to be more maneuverable and capable of being able to handle this additional combat frontline duty other than shooting someone in the face when they're toting around a heavy weapon system. Now, a couple things you got to take into account whenever we're evaluating this type of information here, guys, is that at the end of the day, soldiers are a number. And this might be a little bit of an unpopular idea, but kind of stick with me here. Every soldier is worth X amount. The amount of time spent training them, the amount of time spent feeding and equipping them and all that kind of stuff. There's a certain amount of money that is worth to somebody. And when you consider that you have armies that are quite large, that cost is not insignificant. So anything that you can do to try to alleviate some of those costs is something to be taken into consideration. Now, full power rifle cartridges stuck around even as rifles got shorter into carbine or short rifle lengths, which, though great, the gun is now shorter. Now you have greater recoil, you have greater muzzle blast, you have greater muzzle flash in a weapon system that honestly isn't that much lighter. It's just shorter. And you're not even getting the full ballistic potential out of that full power rifle cartridge once you go to a carbine. So what's the point? And the point is ammunition commonality. So yeah, fine, we gave you a suboptimal rifle, but it's better than not giving you a rifle at all. So thank us for that. And it also allows us to keep our supply train nice and simple so that we don't run into a situation where we send the wrong ammunition to somebody. We don't send enough of the ammunition that they actually needed to somebody. That's a problem. You could really see where that would become a problem. You could see why someone would want to streamline that overall process. And this goes for any wide variety of things, rucksacks, all that kind of stuff. Everyone likes to say the good old joke, oh yes, well, it's the finest equipment made by the lowest bidder. Well, yeah, you know, if you had to supply even just 10 people with a full loadout of equipment off of your budget, you would suddenly be way more interested in what the lowest bidder has to offer at that point, let alone hundreds of thousands, millions of troops. You can see where that becomes imposing. And there's even a trade-off with that. I know we're like far down a rabbit hole because I'm pretty sure I'm rabbit holing off of another rabbit hole right now. But, you know, you look at your average special forces operator, right? That guy has had millions invested into his training, his equipping, his maintaining, all that type of stuff. So much money has been invested into that person, but even he is still a number at the end of the day. So if, let's say, special forces were to double in size overnight, someone would have to sit back and reevaluate the type of equipment and training these guys were getting, because now that cost has just exponentially increased. When it was a smaller overall organization, that was fine because, well, they have a real payoff on the battlefield. There's a risk versus reward here that is in the positive for us. We give them better equipment, they're better able to utilize it. We give them better training to be able to better utilize their equipment so that they can effectively shape the battlefield the way we want them to, in a way that an infantryman cannot, because there are too many of him to be able to equip him in the same way that we would special forces. There's that dynamic trickling out there. But if you increase the size of the special forces, you potentially have to reevaluate that cost versus benefit analysis, and it might go against the Special Forces guys at that point. Just a couple things to keep in mind there. So I say all of this to say, back to the original point, I say all of this to say that it takes a long time for a military to identify something as actually being helpful. Now, the first time we see intermediate cartridges come out is the first time that a military really took a hard look at the fact that if you want radio operators, mortarmen, bazooka men, all these guys who have other combat duties but also need a rifle to be able to keep up with the guys who are just concerned with carrying a rifle, like maneuvering around the battlefield, moving from battle to battle, walking as it may need to be, you're going to want to give them a lighter weapon system and a lighter cartridge to go along with it, something that can actually be effective in that weapon system. So the United States, and I've talked about this before in the PDW concept video and the M1 carbine video and the 30 carbine video. I'll throw the links to all of those in the description. But the United States military set about developing the first intermediate cartridge. They wanted a small 30 caliber cartridge, preferably moving around 2,000 feet per second, capable of engaging out to 300 yards, and could be used in a select fire 5-pound rifle. So now we already see how like a 30-06 is not going to be able to cut this. Now what was developed was the 30 carbine cartridges, the 7.62 by 33, and the M1 carbine. Now, I really like this weapon system. However, I do acknowledge that there's a couple of issues with it. Now, how the US went about designing this cartridge was more or less starting out with a pistol cartridge and making a magnum out of it. Now, that's putting it a little simply because the 30 carbine is a rifle cartridge. It has rifle ballistic characteristics. It has rifle performance at the muzzle. However, it quickly bleeds off that energy, because that velocity and then its relationship with energy, because that's a 110 grain round nose projectile. It's not the most aerodynamic overall design. It doesn't cut through the air that well. So it will hit someone potentially at 300 yards. It's just going to be with a pretty significant drop and with not a lot of effect on target. There have been complaints about this this cartridge's capability on 200-yard, heavily clad, like heavy clothing wearing targets in like winter. There have been a lot of stories about that type of dynamic there. So a couple of things to keep in mind whenever we're talking about the 30 carbine in this case. Now, it's more or less a rimless 357 Magnum, which is cool. If you're talking about engaging sub 200 yards, that's excellent. But it's also why you kind of consider the 30 carbine to be kind of at the anemic end of the intermediate cartridge requirement. But it does outline all the things that you would want to see out of an intermediate cartridge. Something that can be loaded in a lightweight select fire weapon system. The true assault rifle of today. Now, assault rifle, here we go down another little rabbit hole here. Assault rifle is actually kind of a misleading term. It is overused in the media. It is overused by anti-Second Amendment people. An assault rifle is a military weapons term. It is a lightweight, intermediate cartridge chambered weapon system that is capable of select fire. Now, someone might say, well, what about like the G3 or some of the FN FALs? Why, based off of my definition by Murph, why are those not assault rifles? And technically they are, because they are actually indicative of a different branch of assault rifle, which is battle rifles. Now, battle rifles are something that come out post-World War II and are kind of the lighter end of full power rifle cartridge setups, generally 308. 308 is kind of the go-to battle rifle designation at this point. Now, these do not necessarily have to be select fire in order to be battle rifles. So rifles like the British L1A1, which was the British adopted FN FAL, were limited to semi-automatic only. That's still a battle rifle. It's still a semi-automatic detachable box magazine 308 caliber rifle that is meant to be used in a combat type sense. It is a battle rifle at that point. As an infantry arm, it's a battle rifle. But then that would make something like a G3 or a select fire variant of an FN FAL into a assault rifle because it has select fire capability. So it's a assault battle rifle. I guess if you wanted to combine terms, you could do it that way. See, more rabbit holes. We're at like, what, 5 rabbit holes now? So that's kind of where this plays into. Now, the first true expression, because the initial M1 carbine was not made in select fire, was the STG-44, which started kind of being tinkered with in 1943, hit the battlefield by 1944, and pretty much died with the Third Reich in 1945. Now, this weapon system utilized the 7.92 by 33 millimeter Kurz, or 8 millimeter Kurz cartridge, which the Germans went the other direction, where the U.S. kind of stretched out a pistol cartridge. The Germans would decide to cut down a rifle cartridge, give it a Spitzer type bullet, have a necked cartridge casing, all those types of things, which allowed it to get to higher velocities and flatter shooting trajectories, and better able to engage at some of the longer distances that the M1 carbine was trying to be pressed to. This is a successful approach. This is what I want to see. Now, the Russians would take notice of it as well, and they would start working on their 7.62 by 3.9 M43 cartridge, which is what we see chambered in a wide variety of rifles today. They would have that cartridge pretty much finished by 1945 and chambered in the SKS shortly thereafter, and the AK-47 even shorter after that. And this would go on to be the go-to cartridge in the former Soviet bloc, and is actually still very popular on the consumer market here today, and is still widely used in a large number of militaries. And this is kind of channeling that same 8 millimeter Kurz type dynamic, where we have a 30 caliber bullet and with a Spitzer type bullet and a necked cartridge casing. Excellent overall design. Now, the U.S. would take a while to get back into the intermediate cartridge game. In fact, they would decide that they could replace everything with an M14, with a battle rifle. And that would not work out very well. And would not take too long before the U.S. would wind up switching over to the 5.56 millimeter after getting itself embroiled in Vietnam, the 5.56 by 4.5. And we've talked about this dynamic between 308 and 5.56 in my 308 versus 5.56 comparison video, which link in the description for that. So the U.S. adopts this new cartridge, and it's a souped up 22. And this is kind of probably the most popular intermediate cartridge in the United States. It's absolutely excellent. I have been training with it my entire adult life. I grew up with it as well, and I have quite a few of those rifles in my own defensive use right now. I compete with them, all that kind of stuff. Excellent cartridge. Now, the Russians would take notice of the 5.56 by 4.5 millimeter cartridges effect in Vietnam, and they would decide that they kind of wanted something along that line as well, and would develop the 5.45 by 3.9. Now, a lot of Soviet bloc militaries would not be that interested in adopting the 5.45. In fact, they would actually kind of drag their feet. I think there's a couple of things that played into that dynamic overall. So first, I think there were some tensions growing in the Soviet Union between Russia and a lot of its client states, which made them less interested than just dropping everything that we're doing to switch over to an all-new cartridge, especially since they already weren't bothered by 7.62 by 3.9. They didn't consider it to not be performing all that well. In fact, they kind of considered it to be acceptable at worst, and possibly better than the 5.56 to, at the other end of that spectrum. So they were in no rush. And then shortly thereafter, we have the fall of the Soviet Union, which means that a lot of the cartridges a lot of the countries that did decide to switch over to the 5.45 wouldn't stick with it for much longer. Quite a few of them would wind up dropping it for 5.56, and some would even go back to 7.62 by 3.9. So not a lot of people have really stuck with the 5.45. I myself have an interest in the 5.45 because I think it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of neat, and it definitely had a bit of a reputation for effect in Afghanistan, and I find the AK-74's rifles feature set very interesting, and I would like to be able to replicate that in a 5.45 rifle of my own. I've been monitoring ammunition costs for years. We're down another rabbit hole, by the way. I've been monitoring ammunition costs for years and been trying to find a rifle to hop into, but all I ever find are Nodak Spud build 5.45 rifles, and I don't trust those. All I've ever heard are bad things. All right, back on subject. So, now, moving forward, there has been some additional development in the intermediate cartridge realm. However, for the most part, the battle lines have already been drawn. 7.62x3.9 and 5.56 are probably the predominant cartridges overall. However, a couple of niche cartridges have been developed as well. So we have the 300 Blackout, which comes out at one point. And this was first built around the idea of a suppressor host with a more powerful cartridge, and then it really gained favor as a way to be able to adapt a 30 caliber cartridge into the AR-15 platform that's not a 7.62x3.9, that runs off of standard AR-15 parts and is a one-for-one swap in AR-15 magazine capacity and all that kind of stuff. And that's what made the 300 Blackout relatively successful, though the ammunition is still rather expensive. Now, there's actually a Soviet variant of the 5.45, which has been kind of rattling around in the United States here recently, with guys like Brendan Herrera trying to get it to be a mainstream offering in the United States, and that's the 9x39, which was actually developed around the VSS Silent Sniper Rifle, which is super cool, and I really badly want one. As a giggle factor, not because I think it's better than anything else, just as I think it's interesting, and I would love to have it in the collection. But it hasn't caught on yet, and Brendan Herrera seems to be trying so hard to make that happen. Good luck to you, bud. Now, there were also, around the middle point in the War on Terror and the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was some concerns about the 5.56 capability at distance, as well as even in close quarters battle, to where you have just the souped up 22. And sometimes whenever you're shooting at guys with not a lot of body mass, the round has a tendency to just kind of pass through and not necessarily do a lot of damage. And especially once you start pushing it out to range, when it starts losing a lot of its velocity and less of that cavitation capability that the 5.56 cartridge is so well known for, its yaw upon impact, you start to kind of question as to whether or not this is an advantageous cartridge. So this caused people to start looking at 6mm offerings, the 6.5 Grendel and the 6.8 SPC. However, there's a couple of issues with those that never really allowed them to catch on. And that would be that neither one of them fit very well into an AR-15 platform. The 6.5 Grendel will fit into most standard AR-15s, however, it chews up a lot of magazine capacity, which is kind of difficult. It's one of the things that I like about the 5.56 is that I get 30 round mags standard. That is the standard expectation I'm going to get out of capacity. And once you start diminishing that capacity, I start to really question whether or not this other cartridge is giving me any other significant advantage. The 6.8 really needs its own platform. Like, the most successful 6.8s have been those that were built for the 6.8. So it's kind of an AR-15, but it's not really. And the magazines especially need to be specifically designed to be able to get that good capacity out of it. And at that point, you're kind of getting away from the interchangeability of parts with an AR-15. You're kind of killing the overall vibe. You know, it's kind of like why 7.62x3.9 is not as successful in the AR-15 platform, at least in a military sense, if not a civilian sense, than the 300 Blackout. So you can kind of see the back and forth on that overall. You can see why there's a lot of discussion about that. All right, guys. Well, rabbit holes and all, I think I actually... I think I pretty much covered my thoughts on this overall. I hope you guys found this conversation interesting and engaging. If not, I understand. I apologize for wasting your time, and hopefully take a gander around the rest of the channel and see if there's anything else that maybe catches your interest. I hope that there's at least one other video in what I have that is maybe something that you would actually like to indulge in. So, that's pretty much what I got for right now, guys. So, have a good day.